Hey everyone, my name is Devin Cooper, and I'm going to do a presentation today about the grammatical differences between British and American English. The presentation is going to be based mainly on our two textbooks, with some other references thrown in as well, and I will go over those at the end of the presentation. All right, so let's go ahead and get started. A couple key points to remember as I'm going through the presentation. Today I'm talking mostly about grammar, so we'll be referring to syntax or structure of phrases and things like that, and also morphology, so structure of words, affixes that carry, tense meaning, things like that. Another thing to remember is that just like when we talk about lexical or vocabulary differences between British and American English as being quite random, the grammatical differences are also pretty random. I think our textbook sums it up well. So I've included this quote from the Cambridge Encyclopedia of English Language. And they say that a leading reference grammar notes regional trends affecting only about 250 points in morphology or syntax, with many of these affecting individual items, for example, irregular verbs, and very few being general points of syntactic construction. So again, it's random. Grammar in general is systematic and follows patterns, but the differences between the British and the American grammar is going to be more random, is not going to be as systematic. So, what are some of these points of difference? This is kind of an overview of the things that I'll go over in this presentation. I'm not going to read each one, but if you want to pause it right now, you can pause and kind of have a look at everything we're going to talk about. This is not all-encompassing. This is just the main points that were mentioned in our textbooks and in some of the other materials that I've referenced as well. So the first thing I want to talk about are collective nouns, and specifically their agreement with verbs, right? So in British English, most collective nouns are going to take plural verbs. So, for example, a collective noun is something like the government or a sports team. These are things that is a single noun that's referring to a group of people or a group of things. So in British English, it often takes plural, where you might say something like the government are doing XYZ, um, or a sports team, like Spain win the match. Um, Whereas in the United States, we tend to take singular verbs. So we say the government is doing something, or the US soccer team wins the match, right? So that is one particular difference. The next one that I want to talk about is kind of a group of things, phrasal verbs, prepositions, particles, things like this. So, again, randomly, there's kind of a list of things that tend to be different. So, in British English, you might say different to, whereas in American English, we would say different from or different than. Uh, one of the examples listed is tell it him, and I must admit, even from my British friends, I've never heard this before. So I would be curious to find some examples of this. Whereas in American English, we tend to say tell it to him. Uh, in British English, there's a tendency to say live in a street, as opposed to American English, where we might live on a street, right? So um, he lives in Main Street or he lives in High Street, where we might say he lives on Main Street or lives on, 16th Street. Um, in British English, they get in and out of the train, whereas in American English, we get on and off of the train. This is a chart that I have pulled from our textbook, and you can see that it is just a long list of American versus British um, prepositional differences, right? Again, I'm not going to go over each one, but you can pause and you can have a look at these. Okay, the next difference I want to talk about is the difference between using the present perfect and specifically this expression have got, right? So present perfect in general and have got is a much more common construction in British English. So we do use the present perfect in American English, but it has gotten much less common, right? It's fallen out of favor a bit. So, whereas in British English, they might say, I've just returned from a trip, right? We tend to drop that the sound and we tend to just say, I returned from a trip, which actually converts it into a past simple tense. Um, British English have got is such a common expression. So my shoes have got some mud on them. Whereas in American English, we might just say my shoes have some mud on them. If you had asked her, she would have done. This is a particular type of expression, the way that they complete um, a present perfect structure, right? So she would have done versus in American English where we say she would have. So they tend to insert that done, that past participle, whereas we just leave it off, right? Another is this is a huge difference. This is one that everybody talks about, which is the past participle of the verb get. So in American English, we say gotten, right? Gotten. In British English, they use got. So in American English, we might say, my cold hasn't gotten any better yet. Where in British English, gotten doesn't exist. They're going to say, my cold hasn't got any better yet, right? Use of past versus present participles as adjectives. So this is something, and so fun, the personal story, something that I've noticed. There's a YouTuber that I watch a lot, and she is American. She lives in Florida, but she just recently got married, and her husband is British, right? And so she's been spending a lot of time with him and his family, and England, I believe, is where he's from. And so she has started saying things like, I was sat there thinking, or I was stood at the door. And these are very British expressions, right? In American English, we tend to say, I was sitting there thinking, I was standing at the door. So you can really, if you have any friends who are American who've spent a lot of time in England or vice versa, like British friends who've spent a lot of time in the US, you can see when they start to pick up these little phrases and changes in their speech and grammar. So exclusion of articles. There are certain phrases in British English where they don't include articles, where in American English we do, and it sounds odd to us to exclude those articles. So in the US, you are in the hospital, whereas in England, you are in hospital. In American English, we talk about in the future, whereas in British English, they might talk about in future. So they are excluding those articles. Another difference is the pluralization of nouns. So these are the two most common examples that I've pulled. And it's kind of one of those swaps situations where in British English they say sport, where we say sports. British English says maths, where we say math, right? So we've kind of switched out. Um, so someone from England might say something like, I'm very interested in sport, or I'm not very good at maths. Whereas in the United States, we would say it as, I'm not very good at sports, or I'm very interested in math, right? Another difference we can talk about is in auxiliary verbs. So this is, from what I've read, changing a bit in with the British English at least. Needn't and shall um, are still in use, but it seems that they're being used less. So in British English, where someone might say, "Oh, you needn't do that," of course, the American version, you don't need to do that. Um, or talking about the future, right? Shall we, you know, shall we go shopping tonight? Whereas in American English, we tend not to use shall at all. But again, I think that from my understanding is that these two forms in British English are starting to kind of lean toward the more American systems. We can also talk about subjunctive mood, but very specifically, just this idea that the British English tends to occasionally insert the word should into some of their subjunctive phrases. If you've ever taught ESL grammar, specifically from the Azar book, the Blue Book. Um, you will notice that they actually have a little note about including should in their subjunctive um, expressions. So in American English, we might say, I suggest you call her, or I suggest that you call her. And in British English, it's quite common to insert a should in there. I suggest that you should call her. This is less common in American English, although the subjunctive mood is even falling out of American English altogether. I think that we tend not to use it as much as we did in the past, but that's just an observation on my part. Talking about dates, right? So we might say in American English, Christmas is on December 25th, whereas in British English, they might prefer to do it the other way around and say Christmas is on the 25th of December. There are quite a few spelling differences, right? And these can be a little more systematic in terms of just letter patterns, I guess. So in British English, where there's like an OE or an AE combination, words like anemia, diarrhea, encyclopedia, these same words in American English are going to be spelled just with an E. So anemia, diarrhea, encyclopedia, same pronunciation, different spelling. Um, British English tends to use the double L in words like canceled, jeweler, or marvelous, whereas American English, we have simplified it into the singular L. Of course, there are a lot more spelling differences than just this. These are just some of the ones that were highlighted in our texts. Of course, most people are familiar with the OU versus O in words like color. Um, so there are quite a bit more, but these are the ones that, just some examples that were included in the text. Um, this I thought was kind of an interesting idea, and this is not necessarily specifically grammar related, but I thought it was interesting where this idea that when we're judging status, right, when we're assigning um, cultural status or to a person or to a group of people, we use certain things to evaluate like what who do we consider to be high status in a society? Who do we consider to be low status? And this idea was really interesting to me that, in British English, there is so much very specific, very, very small regional variation that there's a strong focus on pronunciation. If you've ever seen the movie or the play or um, My Fair Lady or, Red Pygmalion, you know that this idea of pronunciation and status is very closely linked. Whereas in American English, because, we do have regional differences in pronunciation, clearly, um, but it's a bit broader than in the UK. And so we tend to assign status based on quote unquote proper usage of grammar. Of course, this is perceived proper usage because we could have a whole different conversation about, prescriptivism and things like that. So, again, this is not specific to grammar, but I thought it was a really interesting point to include. So that wraps everything up. My main sources here, like I said, were our text, The Origin and Development of the English Language, but also our text that is the Cambridge Encyclopedia of the English Language. I also found a couple of websites that had interesting articles. Both were from British Council. One was specifically the Indonesia Foundation, and then a couple of YouTube videos that I thought were quite interesting, specifically Lost in the Pond. If you have not had a chance to watch any of his videos, they're quite interesting. It's a British man who moved to the United States, and he lives here with his wife. I think they live in Indiana. And he does all of these differences or all of these videos on the differences that he finds between culture and language and things like that. So if you get a chance to check that out, I think that you might really enjoy it. Anyway, I'm gonna stop there. So I appreciate you guys listening, and I look forward to being able to talk about these ideas with you in our online discussions. All right, thank you all so much.